My name is Daniel Carter. For most of my life, I thought loyalty was simple. You keep your word, you protect the people you love, and when they need you, you are there. The Army taught me how to be steady under fire, how to make decisions when everything is collapsing, how to speak calmly into a radio while the world around you shakes. It did not teach me how to survive being betrayed by the one person I had promised to come home to. Emily and I had been together for 6 years when I deployed. We married in a ridiculous, happy rush the summer after she graduated nursing school. She was the kind of person who laughed like she didn't have a care. Quick, bright, contagious. Her hands were forever fidgeting with the little silver chain she never took off. When she smiled, everything in me eased, even the parts that learned to be sharp and suspicious in the Army. She smelled like lemon soap and warm bread. She had a stubborn streak and a fierce tenderness for the people she loved. At least, that's how I remember her before everything broke. I got orders to deploy to Iraq. It was supposed to be a year. We'd saved a little money, enough for a down payment and to keep the bills paid while I was gone. We talked about babies, quiet plans whispered in the dark while we mapped out payments and mortgages on paper napkins. She told her best friend Megan she'd move in with Megan for the year to save money, a modest rent, $300 a month. Smart, practical. Something that would let us raise ourselves out of the little debts that nagged us. It made sense. I approved it. I kissed her at the airport, held her until my flight was called, and flew toward dust and heat and a job that asked for everything I had. In the beginning, the letters and calls were lifelines. I'd read her emails on the top bunk at night, the base generator humming, and let her voice be a small, steady thing in a world of shouting. But the war has its own hunger. It eats your attention, your time, your patience. Things change slow there and fast in ways that make your chest hollow. At first, her messages were prompt, stuffed with little jokes, with the mundane details that keep people alive, the name of a new barista, a recipe she was trying. Then they shifted. The late replies, the clipped sentences. Busy. Sorry. I'll call later. The small silences stacked into a distance I could feel like a physical thing, like cold air between two sleeping people. Then she told me she needed space. It was the sort of thing that feels absurd coming across a satellite call. I need space. She was 10,000 miles away, crying into the bad connection as if distance could be measured and parceled out. I don't know who I am anymore, she told me. I need to find myself. I remember that call perfectly, the way her words smeared across my eardrum like static. There were a dozen responses I could have given. Beg, plead, threaten, storm home. I did none of them. The scales in my chest tipped toward a kind of terrible clarity. You cannot clutch at someone who's moving away, even with both hands.
Before that, there had been a friend from home, Jason. He'd always been around when we were younger, the loud, cocky guy at the college parties, a little too familiar with anything that wasn't his. Emily insisted, he's just a friend. That sentence has a heat to it when you're standing in the desert listening to the radio, protective and hopeful and, in my case, naive. When she said she needed space, Jason began to appear in her photos more and more, on Instagram, on the occasional tagged post. Not like a photobomb joke, more the kind of presence that shifted into the foreground the way smoke sits thick in a room until it obscures everything else. I wasn't usually the jealous type. I trusted her. That trust had navigated us through small storms and petty fights, through nights when the power went out and the heater sputtered, and we learned to find warmth in each other. But there was a slow erosion now. I started noticing patterns, little things that didn't fit, and curiosity, when it settles in a soldier's heart, becomes something sharp and clinical. In a war zone, you learn how to gather data, how to triangulate and deduce. The training didn't distinguish between threats on the battlefield and threats in your bed. I cloned her phone. It sounds like something out of a movie. Cold, illegal, desperate. And in truth, it was all of those. I used a service that let me receive the same message as she did, a number for which I had the login details. The first notification came while I was on watch, a small buzz against my thigh. I checked it, half distracted by the distant thud of generators and the rasp of the desert wind. On my screen, a message from her, the kind of domestic, trivial text that now felt like an accusation. "Hey babe, I'll see you after work. Want me to save any of my leftovers?" Babe. That single casual word was the crack in my sternum. My stomach folded inward. I read the next message, the next. They were patient, intimate, the kind of messages that stitch people into a life. "I can't wait until we have a baby together. You make me feel alive. I love you." They were not messages meant for my ears. I should have stopped. Instead, I read every one like evidence at a trial. I let it burn me. The next weeks were a slow, nauseating drag. I didn't sleep. I stopped eating. My body learned hunger on a new scale. Faces looked like refractions. I watched the exchanges as if they were a feed of weather radar, tracing the slow storm line over their relationship. She and Jason bought matching tattoos. She called him things: babe, love, whatever daytime pet names people use when they're building a life that isn't yours. On paper, the timestamp spoke with cruel precision. Dates, times, plans, all intersecting with my deployment pay heading into the unknown.
When I finally confronted her, it was not with fury or with triumph. That wasn't how this felt. It felt clinical, like removing a bandage to find the wound had deeper roots than you imagined. "Are you seeing someone?" I asked, carefully neutral, my voice a practiced flat line. She dodged, then crumpled. "Yes," she admitted. "I'm with someone. He treats me better. He does what I need." That last line, "he does what I need," landed like the inevitable verdict in a court that no longer allowed me to plead my case. I remember the feeling afterward, a stillness so absolute it was almost loud. It's strange how betrayal does not always ring like thunder. Sometimes it is a precise, surgical silence that rewires the nerve. I could have screamed. I could have struck. Instead, I set into motion things that required patience, method, the same discipline I'd learned on missions where fast action without planning gets you killed. First, I froze the joint account. I changed passwords, military jargon, words and phrases she'd never think of, and locked her out. It felt petty, like snapping a twig at first. But money is the scaffolding of everyday life. When the scaffolding fails, structures wobble. Her car payments missed. Then the repo man took the sedan we'd once shuttled to weekend farmers markets. She pawned shoes and bags, things I'd bought when we thought we were building a stable house, and the sight of her selling the trinkets of a shared life felt like a private justice. I blocked her on social media and phone. I wanted the world to close on what she'd done without my constant watch. She had chosen to erase me. The reverse was a necessary, cold symmetry. But wealth had only been part of what built her new life. The human part, the reputation, the face, mattered more. I had the messages. I had timestamps. So I compiled them, screenshots side by side, her declarations to me, her promises, and her words to Jason about building a baby and a future together. I shared them privately with people who mattered in our small town. Friends, co-workers, a cousin of hers who still cared about our history. The first person who got them, an old friend named Marcus, did what people sometimes do with incendiary news. He passed it along.
Within days, it had the slow, unstoppable momentum of gossip that becomes fact simply through wheels and whispers. People who had known us since high school began to send me messages, shocked. Others applied the kind of quiet, sharp judgments that come from surprising someone you thought you knew. This was not spectacle. It was exposure, the kind that leaves rubble in its wake, but does so quietly. She lost her job at the restaurant where she'd worked. Friends called and complained. An orchestrated dine and dash campaign by a few sympathetic comrades didn't help her standing. People showed up at the place where she now tried to scrape a life together and made their displeasure known. She tried to call base command to say I'd abandoned her, to paint me as the villain who left his wife and broke the household. But my commander, an older man who had sat across the table from me more than once and seen the way a man can be hollowed out by life, knew. He'd been through his own form of betrayal once. He saw the situation for what it was, a mess of adult choices with no obligation of military intervention. He let the report slide. 2 months before my return, she called from an unknown number. She said, "I'm pregnant." The testifying, quiet inner voice made the word heavy. "It's his, not yours." She wanted pity. She wanted inertia. I didn't give it. "I'm sorry," I said, and placed the phone down. Actions must be decisive so that people know you mean them. I wanted the line in the sand to be unambiguous. She had chosen her path. I was no longer the architect of it. When I finally came home, the house was hollow in a way that living people sometimes are. There were fewer photographs on the wall, some with her cropped faces, and evidence of a life that tried to fit two people who had gradually been removed from each other. We divorced before the child was born. It was quick, clean, and precisely what I'd asked for. Legally, the divorce severed me from obligation. No child support, no spousal maintenance. For the cold efficiency of the paperwork, I expected something like relief. Instead, I felt the strange lightness of being exonerated for something you never had a chance to defend. Revenge for me stopped being a series of raids or vindictive acts and became a strategy of removal. When you remove money, access, presence, you force the other person to stand on their own. Some people are better at standing than others. The first time she called me after the child was born, her voice was hollowed out by wear. "He hit me," she said one night through tears. "Jason hit her," she said. She had been 5 months pregnant, living in a rental that had slowly fallen out from under them. My first impulse wasn't malice. A part of me twisted, a bitter thing that enjoyed the momentary justice. Another part, one that hadn't been entirely burned by what she'd done, felt a tiny, hollow pity for the woman who had, in a sense, been my anchor and my undoing. "Call the police," I told her. "Get somewhere safe." My words were brief because compassion, after betrayal, can become a reward for bad choices. She pushed it into my face, asking if I reveled in her pain. My answer was flat. "No, I'm glad I'm not the bad guy anymore." There is a cruel lesson in watching karma play out. It does not always appear instantly. It turns, congeals, and then moves like weather finally catching up. Slow, inevitable, and indifferent to your passions. Jason lost his job, not through direct machinations by me, but through the domino effect of people's discomfort and the small professional ties that unpicked. He drank. He lashed out. Their relationship, built on the fragile architecture of thrill and novelty, had no scaffolding for the long-term erosion of dishonesty. I heard from mutual contacts that at one point he was gone from town with promises, leaving Emily to pick threads of dignity from the hem of a life she'd undone. Karma does not need you to strike the last blow. Sometimes it simply reveals the consequences of choices, and they fall like rotten fruit. For a long time, I watched myself in the mirror and did not recognize the man reflecting back. The desert had given me its own skin.
hard, methodical, a man who calculates consequences. At first, I mistook that hardening for ruin. Later, I recognized it as a renovation. I used the energy that had been a furnace of anger and redirected it into work, into silence, in rebuilding a life that did not revolve around the woman who had hurt me. There's a ritual in recovery that people don't talk about, the small, mundane tasks that feel like prayer because they happen daily. I went to the gym at dawn, ran until my lungs hurt, salted and retrained my body. I took classes through the VA, learned logistics and infrastructure, rebuilt a career. I dialogued with friends who had been through divorces and betrayals. They gave me hard advice that read like truth. Do not reply. Do not apologize. Do not be bait. When she texted years later asking for rent money, "Please, I'm behind, I just need a little help," I deleted it. That deletion was not cruelty. It was boundary. It was preservation. My silence became a shield. I never did anything monstrous. I didn't ruin children or threaten people. I left the destruction to their own choices, which is sometimes the sharpest revenge of all. People who have the luxury to hurt you rarely think in dominoes. They operate impulsively, and their lives tend to calcify around impulse. Letting their impulses face consequences can be punitive in its own way. People ask me now if I celebrated her suffering. The answer is complex. There was a small human satisfaction in seeing fairness restored, like a scale that had tipped too far and finally rebalanced. But it wasn't joy. It was confirmation. It was the sick relief that comes from proof. I wasn't thirsty for her ruin. I wanted, desperately, for justice to feel tangible so I could sleep. There were days afterward when I would walk through the neighborhood and see her ghost in ordinary things. A cup she'd favored at a coffee shop, the tilt of a willow tree, lights across a porch. At first, these moments gutted me. Then they flattened and became part of a wider quiet. What used to signal lost became a reminder of survival. In the months after the divorce, rumor and gossip painted pictures of Emily's decline. Job losses, moving in with parents, single parenting at a pace that chewed at her reserves. I got one or two texts from mutual friends, a mix of pity and schadenfreude. "She's okay," one friend wrote, and I believed him, because what else could I do besides believe that she, like me, was waking the next day and trying to be a whole person? Let me be precise about a truth that matters. Revenge can destroy, but it also reveals. Mine revealed how much of my life I had ceded, my emotional safety, my reliance on her supposed fidelity. What I built afterward had a different architecture, not brittle faith in others, but rigidity in my own responsibilities and boundaries. I learned to enjoy myself again, not to be reckless and repeat mistakes, but to taste pleasure unafraid. Years later, when people ask whether I'd do things differently, I tell them that hurt rewrites your priorities. I might have confronted her sooner, or longed less for the person she'd ceased to be, but the core learning remains. Protect your peace. If you hand over the keys to your life to someone and they use them to walk away, it's hard work to get them back. It's slower than anger. It requires slow plumbing of the self. There's a motif I recall often. A watch she gave me the week before I left. An old thing, with a leather strap and a face that glowed faintly in the dark. It was mine once, but in the end it was just metal and glass. After she left, I wore it less. It ticked on in its small mechanical world, indifferent to marriages. There is something comforting in that impartiality. The watch that keeps time regardless of human drama. I learned to be that watch, to keep my own time independent of other people's storms. Revenge turned inward became restoration. I started dating again, slowly, like a man easing the first cold water down his spine. Not because I wanted to prove anything, but because one day, when I supposed my guard down and felt comfortable, I found someone whose loyalty was quiet and urgent in the right places. She listened. She did not make wild promises she could not keep. She loved the small domestic things a steady life needs. We married 6 years later, quiet, practical, unromantic in the best ways. And in the small domestic rituals of morning coffee and grocery runs, I found a kind of tenderness that was not theatrical, It did not require constant proof. It only demanded consistency. I don't want to romanticize what happened. Betrayal leaves scars that sometimes ache without warning. The nights I spent awake in the early years of that divorce were full of regret. Not regret that I'd been cheated on, but regret at the parts of myself I'd ceded. I had to retrieve myself in small, stubborn ways. I relearned what I loved: books, an old guitar, the particular way the lake looked in the spring before the leaves blistered. I asked for help when I needed it. I stopped pretending that being a man meant never acknowledging vulnerability. Emily never became a villain in my inner story. She was a person who made choices, some of them selfish, some of them destructive, all of them human. People make terrible decisions for reasons that rarely validate the hurt they cause. That recognition doesn't absolve them. It simply reframes the narrative. We are all messes in motion, and sometimes our motions harm others. A friend once told me, revenge is a bad blueprint for a life. Redemption is better. There's truth in that. My revenge, the quiet, calculated moves that stripped away the scaffolding of her choices, was a vehicle to reach something better than petty vindication. It carried me toward a version of myself that was steady again, capable of trust and discernment without naivete. It is a strange thing to admit that letting karma do its slow work felt more honest than taking the wheel with the throttle pressed down. Karma, and its slow wisdom, can sometimes be more efficient than your rage. Sometimes people say to me, "Is there any part of you that wishes you had struck harder?" The answer is no. The violence of fury tends to damage the person giving it more than the person receiving it. I wanted evidence, not blood. I wanted certainty, not ruin. I wanted to be free of the dead weight of doubt that had compressed my chest for months in the desert. Once I had that certainty, the rest was simply life enforcement, boundaries, removed obligations, a decision to move forward. I would not wish the path I walked on anyone. Betrayal is a corrosive thing. It dissolves faith, gnaws patience, and reassigns the coordinates of who you are. But out of that corrosion, if you are careful, you can mine a sturdier metal. I did not throw the pieces away, I repurposed them. Patience where I had anger, caution where I had naive trust, and a tenderness reserved for those who proved worthy of it. There is, finally, a kind of peace that came the day I realized I no longer rehearsed our past. I did not replay the messages. I did not check old logs. I walked past coffee shops without wondering if Emily had just sat there. My life was not a series of reactions anymore. It was an authored narrative again.
If there is a moral in the story, it is not that revenge is righteous. It is that agency matters. When someone betrays you, reclaim your agency, not by lowering yourself into their mud, but by constructing a life that refuses the old terms of your being. Let karma take its slow work. Do the rest by living well. Sometimes, after everything, the most devastating and satisfying revenge was the trivial human thing: prosperity. I did not become vengeful with visible malice. I got promoted. I went back to school. I found love that was steady and unexotic, the sort of love that would hold up through dull, ordinary days. That, in itself, was the quiet annihilation of a story that had once been built on lies. When someone assumes you are easily replaceable, the slow accusation of your thriving afterward is unstoppable. On certain nights, when the world is still, and the watch on my wrist ticks its tiny, impartial beats, I think of Emily. Not with anger, not with yearning. More like an archaeologist standing before a cleared site, seeing what was left and what I will rebuild. That distance is a gift. It is the lattice on which you weave a new life. She lost herself trying to chase a short taste of excitement. I lost pieces of myself to the hurt that came after.
Then, slowly, methodically, I took back all the pieces I needed and built a life that belonged to me. The rest, the gossip, the karma, the small humiliations she endured, were externalities, part of a wider tapestry that grew around both of us. If you've loved and been betrayed, know this: the first weeks are the hardest. You will stagger. You will think old things could have been fixed with visits or apologies or frantic last-minute confessions. Then, one morning, after a series of small acts that stitch you back together, new routines, new work, old friends, you will feel ordinary happiness like a soft return. That return is not insignificant. It is reclamation. I never intended to be cruel. I intended to be just, as justice is understood by someone who has been wronged. Proportionate, decisive, and clean. I wished for no permanent harm, only an equitable mirror to show the consequences. The world is messy, and most people do not get such mirrors. I had one, and I used it. To the listener, if you are in the fire of betrayal now, do not let the flame define you. Gather your resources, make measured choices, and steward the small things: your sleep, your food, your work, your friends. The rest, whether it is revenge or karma, is the slow work of the world catching up to itself. Live in ways that cannot be taken from you easily. Your integrity, your habits, your capacity to rise again. I don't know how Emily's life will unfold. I don't need to. My story is mine. When people ask if I regret what I did, I answer honestly. Not the restraint, not the calculated boundaries. I regret the pain that was inevitable in the unspooling, but not the peace I earned. I regret losing parts of myself earlier, but I don't regret the man I became after digging them out. Revenge was a chapter, not the whole book. I let karma finish what I started, but the last scene wasn't her humiliation. It was my quiet rebuilding and the dull, unromantic act of becoming someone who can love again without looking over his shoulder. That is the end of it for me. Not a triumphant shout, not a parade, just a late afternoon, a cup of coffee, and the watch on my wrist ticking like a small, private promise that time in the end keeps moving, no matter what anyone else decides to do.